Can I prove with absolute certainty that God is real? No, I can't. Can I prove with absolute certainty that God isn't real? No, I can't do that either. In fact, can I prove anything about reality with absolute certainty? From everything I can see, no, I can't. And I'll explain why. I remember when I used to be an atheist, one of the biggest reasons I didn't believe in God was because I didn't see any proof that God was real. People would tell me that God existed, and my response would basically be something like, okay, then prove it. Show me something undeniable. Show me something that proves God is absolutely real. And because nobody could give me that kind of proof, I assumed believing in God was irrational. But as I got older, I began searching for the meaning of life, and that eventually led me into philosophy. And when I started learning about philosophy, I realized something I'd never considered before. I realized I was demanding a level of certainty for God that I couldn't reach for any of my own beliefs. From everything I could see, absolute certainty didn't appear to be available to any of us. And here's what I mean. First, we need to define just a few words, okay? When I say absolute certainty, I mean knowing something in a way that leaves no possible chance that you could be wrong about it. And when I use the word proof in this video, I mean something that would establish a conclusion with that level of certainty. Something that would show beyond every possible doubt that what you believe is true. Now, people often use the word proof when they really mean evidence, but those are not the same thing. Evidence is information that gives us a reason to believe one explanation is more likely to be true than another. Evidence can give us an extremely good reason to believe something without making it completely impossible for us to be wrong about it. And that difference between proof and evidence is extremely important. Now, let's go into why it appears that we can't prove anything with absolute certainty. Every conclusion and belief we come to depends on certain basic human tools, things like logic, reasoning, and perception. We use these tools to understand reality, to form our beliefs, and decide what we think is true. But here's the problem. I can't test those tools without already using them. Here's what I mean. Let's take logic for example. How would I prove that logic works? I would have to make a logical argument. But that means I would already be using logic before I had proven that logic works. Put simply, I would be using logic to prove logic. And the same thing happens with reasoning. How would I prove that my ability to reason is actually reliable? I would have to reason my way to that conclusion. I would already be relying on reasoning before I had shown that reasoning was reliable. And perception has the same basic problem. Everything I know about the physical world comes to me through my human senses and mind. I can't take my mind off like a pair of glasses and set it down on a table and then look at reality without it. Everything I see, everything I hear, and everything I experience comes through those glasses. I can't step completely outside of my own human experience and compare what I perceive with reality completely unperceived. Put simply, I can only examine reality through the same mind and senses that I'm trying to test. Now, none of this means that logic is false. None of this means that reasoning is useless. And it doesn't mean our senses have no connection to reality. Obviously, we have to use these tools. We can't think, we can't speak, we can't question, or investigate anything without them. The point I'm trying to make is simply that I can't stand somewhere completely outside of them and prove their perfect reliability from some totally separate position. And because every conclusion and belief I come to depends on these tools that I can't verify, that I can't prove, and because every conclusion and belief I come to depends on these tools, I can't prove any conclusion or belief I reach through them with absolute certainty either. And here's the really strange part too. To be completely consistent and intellectually honest here, I can't prove that conclusion that I just came to with absolute certainty either. I can't absolutely prove that absolute proof is impossible. What I can say though is that from everything I can see, every attempt to prove something appears to depend on something it cannot completely prove. So where does that leave us, right? Does that mean we should stop believing anything? Does it mean every belief is equally reasonable? No, it doesn't mean either of those things. It means the best thing we can do is use the tools available to us. Things like logic, reasoning, and perception to look at the evidence, compare the possible explanations, and come to the most reasonable conclusion we can. That is the best move available to us. And here's a really simple example of what I mean. Imagine you're sitting in your house, right? And suddenly you hear a loud crash in another room. You walk into the room. You see a broken window, shattered glass on the floor, and a soccer ball sitting in the middle of the room. So you look at all the evidence, right? You heard a loud crash, the window's broken, there's glass everywhere, and there's a soccer ball sitting on the floor. Based on that evidence, what's the most reasonable explanation for what happened? Probably that the soccer ball came through the window. That would explain the loud crash, the broken window, the shattered glass, and the soccer ball sitting in the room. But can you prove with absolute certainty that this is exactly what happened? No, you can't. Technically, the soccer ball could have already been sitting there. And maybe somebody ran past the house with a hammer, smashed the window, and then ran away. Maybe it only looks like the soccer ball came through the window. Can you absolutely prove that that didn't happen? No. But is that explanation equally supported by the evidence? Also no. Meaning, just because another explanation is technically possible doesn't mean it's equally reasonable. Based on the evidence available to you, the soccer ball explanation still makes the most sense. So even though you can't prove it with absolute certainty, you still have very good reason to believe it. And that's the point. A conclusion does not have to be absolutely certain for it to be the most reasonable conclusion. Now let's go back to the God question. If somebody asks me why I believe God is real, that's a completely reasonable thing to ask. If somebody asks what evidence I have for believing that, that is completely reasonable too. I should be willing to explain why I believe what I believe. But if somebody demands that I prove God's existence with absolute certainty in a way that removes every possible chance that I could be wrong, that is an unreasonable standard. Because no complete view of reality appears capable of meeting that. I cannot prove with absolute certainty that God exists. But somebody who claims that God does not exist cannot prove that with absolute certainty either. Neither of us can step outside of our own human minds and prove our entire understanding of reality from some completely separate position. Now, to be clear, none of this proves that Christianity is true, and that's not the point of this video. The point is that Christianity and every other worldview should be judged by the evidence and reasoning supporting it, and not automatically rejected because it cannot meet an impossible standard of certainty. So the right question is not, can you prove everything you believe with absolute certainty? The right question is, what evidence and reasoning do you have to support what you believe? And if you demand absolute certainty from somebody else while accepting your own beliefs without absolute certainty, then you're applying a double standard, which is exactly what I used to do. And this was a massive realization for me, because when I was an atheist, I used the lack of absolute proof as a reason to dismiss belief in God. I thought, if nobody can absolutely prove God to me, then believing in God must be irrational. But eventually, I realized that I didn't apply that same standard to myself. I couldn't prove my own beliefs about reality with absolute certainty either. And that realization was like hitting a giant reset button in my mind. I can no longer dismiss God by simply saying, you haven't absolutely proven him to me. Instead, I had to look at the evidence, and I had to question my own beliefs, and I had to compare Christianity with the view of reality I was already living by. It forced me to stop waiting for some impossible proof and start asking a much more honest question. That question being, which explanation of reality actually makes the most sense? So overall, if I can leave you with just one thing from all of this, this is what it would be. Can I prove with absolute certainty that God is real? No. Can I prove with absolute certainty that God isn't real? No. Can I prove anything about reality with absolute certainty? From everything I can see, no, I can't. But that doesn't mean truth doesn't exist. And it doesn't mean every belief is equally reasonable. It means absolute certainty is the wrong standard to demand. When we're talking about God, our worldview, and what reality ultimately is, asking for evidence is reasonable. Asking someone why they believe something is reasonable. But demanding perfect certainty is not. The best thing any of us can do is use the tools available to us, look at the evidence, compare the possible explanations, and come to the most reasonable conclusion we can. So the real question is not, can you prove your worldview with absolute certainty? The real question is, which worldview best explains the reality we actually experience?